The radio crackled once, then silence, then her voice. It was calm in a way that had no business being calm in that moment in that valley, with the fire coming down from two ridgelines simultaneously and the night broken open by the sound of things that ended lives. Steady in a way that reached through the noise and the fear and the particular chaos of a night gone catastrophically wrong, and told 480 men something their training had not prepared them to hear from that direction. She said, "Alpha element, pull back west, 150 meters. Use the drainage channel on your left. Move now." Commander Nate Harwick pressed his back against a boulder the size of a truck and listened to that voice and understood in the specific way that 30 years of operational experience produces understanding that something was happening that he did not have a full model for. He had 480 operators in this valley. 480 of the most trained, most tested, most capable men the United States Navy had ever produced, deployed to a mountain range at the edge of a country they had been coming to for more than 2 decades, tasked with a mission that the intelligence package had rated as straightforward. The intelligence package had been wrong. The fire coming down from the eastern ridge was not the fire of an opportunistic ambush. It was coordinated, layered, timed with the precision of people who had known they were coming. The western ridge was adding to it from the other direction. The valley floor, which had looked navigable on every drone image and satellite pass for the past 2 weeks, had become something else entirely in the space of 90 seconds. Tracer rounds cut orange lines through the black air above him. Somewhere to his left, a man was screaming the way men scream when something has gone wrong with their body in a way they do not yet fully understand. Somewhere to his right, 2 men had gone quiet in a way that was different from screaming away, that told him something definitive about their condition without requiring him to look. He keyed his radio. "Doc, medics are trying to reach you. What is your position?" A pause, 4 seconds, 5, long enough for him to think the worst. "Then, I'm managing commander. Focus on the north corridor. There is a mortar team repositioning approximately 200 meters east of your location. You need to move your wounded before they reestablish a firing solution." He started to respond. She cut through him with the specific confidence of someone who is looking at the problem from above and can see what the people at sea that cannot. "Move your wounded first, sir. I will still be here when you have." Harwick stared at the radio in his hand for 1 full second. He had 30 years of experience and several dozen firefights behind him, and the radio had never said that to him before. Not in that voice, not with that particular quality of calm that was not the absence of fear, but something that lived on the other side of fear, something produced by a combination of knowledge and commitment that he had encountered very rarely in 3 decades of doing this work. He made a decision. He did what she said. Later, much later, when men who had been in Fallujah and Kandahar and the green valleys of the Korangal were asked to describe that night, most of them reached for the same words and found them insufficient. They said they had never heard a voice like that come over a radio, not in all their combined years of service. They said it was the kind of voice that found you in the dark and grabbed something interior and held it steady when everything external was moving in every direction at once. She held the radio in her right hand and lay behind a flat rock on the northern slope with a bullet wound in her left shoulder that she had packed herself one-handed with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to treat trauma without the luxury of choosing when it arrived. The blood had soaked through the packing and into her jacket, and she was cold in the specific way that blood loss makes you cold from the inside out. But she was conscious and she was thinking clearly, and her right hand was steady. She kept talking. 477 men who should not have seen sunrise saw it because of what she did that night. This is not the story of the battle. This is the story of the 18 hours that came before it. Of a morning that began with a helicopter and a duffel bag and a room full of experienced, serious professional men who looked at her and knew with the absolute certainty of people who have long since stopped doubting their own judgment exactly what she was and what she was capable of. They were wrong about nearly everything. The forward operating base sat at 6,000 feet in a fold of the eastern mountains, in the kind of place that exists on military maps and nowhere else the kind of place that has no permanent name, because permanence is not the point of it. It had a generator, 3 prefabricated structures joined by covered walkways, a medical tent on the northern side, a communications array that pulled satellite signals from across the sky, and a perimeter that had been reinforced twice in the preceding week by men who understood that reinforcement was not pessimism, but preparation. The mountains rose on 3 sides. The 4th side opened onto the valley. The air at 6,000 feet in late March carried a cold that was not the cold of winter storms, but the cold of altitude persistent and thin, the kind that worked through layers and settled in the joints, and that the men stationed there had learned to move through without acknowledging it. Soldiers learn to move through things that cannot be removed. The cold was one of those things. The last helicopter of the day came in from the southwest at 1700 hours as running low along the ridge to minimize its exposure profile, and it touched down on the pad, and the rotor wash moved across the base like a flat hand sweeping a table. The crew chief pushed 2 fuel cells and a pallet of medical resupply off the back, and then one person stepped down off the ramp, and the helicopter was gone before she had crossed the landing pad. She stepped into the rotor wash and it hit her, and her hair snapped sideways, and she caught it with one hand, without breaking stride, without looking up, without any of the hesitations that people who are arriving somewhere new display when they are new to it. She already knew where she was going. The base layout had been part of the mission package, and she had memorized it 3 days earlier when she was reviewing the intelligence on the deployment. She had also memorized something else from that package, something she had not told anyone. She had noticed something that had been the reason she applied for this slot in the first place. She carried this piece of knowledge the way she carried the letter in her inside pocket, close, quiet, accessible when needed. The duffel over her shoulder was standard issue black. The medical kit in her right hand was a hard-shell Pelican case, also black. She wore gray cargo pants and a navy fleece, and she moved across the landing pad the way someone moves when they have a destination and nothing to prove about getting there. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs was standing at the edge of the landing pad with a tablet in his hand when she passed within 8 feet of him. He was 6'2" and 220 pounds of 12 years of operational service and Delta Cross training, and he watched her walk past him with the measurement he applied to everything that entered his operational space, which was immediate, total, and without apology. He turned to the operator beside him and said what he was thinking without editorial adjustment. "She's smaller than her bag." The operator beside him started to respond, looked at Briggs' expression, and reconsidered. Briggs was not technically wrong about the size. She was 5'4" on her best morning, maybe 118 pounds in full gear. She had dark brown hair pulled back with the functional practicality of someone who solved problems rather than managed appearances, and a face that was young enough that the base's outer sentry had checked her contractor ID twice before waving her through. Her eyes were dark and moved quickly, and with a quality that Briggs, had he been paying different attention, might have recognized as systematic. The eyes of someone cataloging rather than observing, taking in information with a purpose that was not casual. But Briggs was not paying that kind of attention. He had made his assessment, and his assessment was complete, and he was already moving on to the next thing, which was the fuel cell inventory and the mission timeline and the 17 other items on his internal checklist that required attention before 2100. Her name was Tessa Cole. She was listed in the operational roster as a Navy corpsman and civilian medical contractor assigned to the unit at the specific request of Naval Special Warfare Command to fill a slot that had opened unexpectedly 4 days earlier. Her credentials were clean: Johns Hopkins Medical School trauma certification, 2 prior deployments in non-kinetic support roles. Medical record of service 53, confirmed field interventions. All 53 had survived. That last number was the one that had caught Commander Harwick's attention when he reviewed her file that morning. He had read it once and then read it again, not because he doubted the number, but because 53 for 53 in field conditions was the kind of statistic that raised a question about what kind of person produced it. He found her in the medical tent 40 minutes after the helicopter landed. She had already organized the supply crates by medication category and trauma classification, and was cross-referencing the existing inventory against the projected mission timeline on a notepad with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had done this before and knew what she was doing and did not need to perform the knowing for anyone watching. She looked up when he came in, not startled, not performing attentiveness, just redirected. "Commander Harwick, you reviewed the mission brief." "Yes, sir." "Questions?" She tilted her head slightly, the head tilt of someone selecting from a longer list. "The projected casualty estimate uses pre-2021 baseline data for this region. Given current atmospheric conditions and the altitude differential between the insertion point and the target valley, I'd adjust that figure upward by about 20%. He looked at her. "I raise it only because it affects supply positioning," she continued. "If we lose access to the primary medical station in the first hour, which the terrain profile makes plausible, I'd want pre-staged kits at 3 secondary locations. I can set those up this evening." Hara considered her for a moment. He had expected questions about the communication channels, a request for the casualty extraction plan, standard contractor concerns that were legitimate but routine. He had not expected her to have already completed a risk analysis on the casualty projections. "Set up whatever you need," he said. He walked out of the tent and stood in the cold air for a moment before continuing on. He made a note, not a written one. The internal kind stored in the place where the things that might matter later are kept until they are needed. Briggs made his assessment known 3 times before dinner. The first time was at the equipment check when he noted aloud that the medical kit she had requested access to from the forward cache was more comprehensive than any field kit he had seen outside of an actual trauma center. The second time was during the afternoon briefing, when she sat in the back row and said nothing for 40 minutes, but watched the topographic overlay with an attention that Briggs noticed without fully processing the way you notice a thing at the edge of vision without turning to look at it directly. The third time was at dinner when he sat across from 3 other operators and stated with the flat certainty of a man reading weather conditions that she was going to be a liability in the field. He said it without cruelty. In Briggs's world, liability was the most critical word in the working vocabulary. Liability was the variable that got people killed. Liability was what you identified and removed from an operational equation before the equation went live. He was protecting his element. He would have said so, and he would have meant it, and he would not have been entirely wrong to frame it that way. What he could not know was that she had heard him from the other side of the canvas divider. She sat on the other side of that divider and finished her meal and said nothing. Her father had taught her this. Deflection is economy. Hold your words for the moments that require them. Everything before that is noise, and engaging noise is how you exhaust the things you need for the work. She had been practicing this economy for 16 years. She was very good at it. Chief Petty Officer Vance Dunbar found her at the perimeter wire as the afternoon became evening. He was 53 years old, built in the way that men who have been doing serious physical work for 3 decades are built, with a stillness about him that was different in quality from the stillness of younger men. The stillness of someone who has processed a large number of difficult things and arrived at the far side of processing, carrying all of them and still moving at the same pace. He had said almost nothing since she arrived. He had watched her from across rooms with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not open either, the expression of a man who is in the process of confirming a suspicion. He found her standing at the eastern edge of the base, looking out over the valley as the shadow filled it from the bottom, up the way shadow always fills valleys like water rising. He stood beside her and looked at the same valley for a long moment before he spoke. "Your father's name was Frank Cole." She was still for 1 beat, 2 beats, a very deliberate stillness. "Yes," she said. "SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia, 3 tours in Afghanistan, retired 2012. She turned to look at him then. "I trained at Coronado with him in 1995, Dunbar said. "I was 24 years old and I had arrived at that range with the absolute certainty of a young man who has been told he is excellent and has not yet encountered anyone who can demonstrate exactly what excellent actually looks like." A pause. Frank spent 45 minutes adjusting that certainty. He was polite about it. That almost made it worse. "He never mentioned you," she said. "He mentioned very few people by name." That was Frank. Dunbar looked back at the valley. "He mentioned you, though, not directly and not often. But once when I ran into him at Coronado about 4 years before he died, he said his daughter had something he called the eye. He said it was the rarest thing he had encountered in 40 years of looking, and that he was spending considerable effort helping it become something that understood its own weight." She said nothing. "He passed in 2019. March 14th, cerebral hemorrhage. He was 57 years old and had come through Desert Storm in Somalia and 3 tours, and he died in a hospital in San Diego 3 days after a stroke that arrived without announcement." She said this without bitterness and without the softening that people use when they are performing grief rather than carrying it. It was a recitation of facts that she had lived with long enough that they had settled into something she could say directly. Dunbar nodded. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you." The valley was dark now, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge, and the generator behind them cycled, and the lights in the main structure flickered and held. "The way you looked at that topographic overlay this afternoon," Dunbar said quietly. "The way your eyes moved to the ridge lines and not the valley floor when you were listening to the Overwatch discussion." He paused. That was Frank. She did not respond to that. "I am not asking you anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not asking, I am saying what I observed, and I am saying that I understand what it means, and whatever you came here prepared to do, you will not be doing it with everyone in this base unaware of what they have. He looked at her. Someone should know. That someone is Masim, and now you know that I know. He walked back toward the base without waiting for a response. She stood at the wire for a long time after that. There is something you need to know about Frank Cole before this story goes any further. He was not a famous man. His name appears in no published account of any operation he participated in across 30 years of service. There are no documentaries, no books with his photograph, no interviews given to journalists or historians or the producers of cable television programs about special operations. In the world where his reputation existed, it existed the way the most important things exist in that world passed between men in conversation, in the specific and unrecorded way that matters most. He joined the Navy at 18. He moved through basic underwater demolition and SEAL training with a particular combination of physical endurance and mental economy that the instructors at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado recognized and could not fully account for. He was not the strongest candidate in his class, not the fastest. He was the one who, when conditions became genuinely unbearable, seemed to subtract himself from the unbearable and continue functioning from somewhere else, somewhere quieter and more internal, a place that the training was designed to find and that not everyone had. He became a SEAL, and then he became very good at it, and then he became something rarer than that, which is a man who understands not only how to do the work, but why it is worth doing and the significant distance between those two understandings. Desert Storm in 1991. Somalia in 1993, the Battle of Mogadishu. In October of that year, a battle that became a word that carries specific meaning in military history. 3 tours in Afghanistan across the decade that followed the towers. Long-range overwatch work that never appeared in any after-action report in any form that could be recovered through a Freedom of Information request. He became, in the language of his world, a ghost, not because he sought that designation, but because it was accurate. He retired in 2012. He settled in San Diego. He ran every morning at 5:30 and maintained his equipment and taught when asked at a private facility whose name does not appear in this account for reasons that should be self-evident. And when his daughter was 10 years old, he put a rifle in her hands. Not because he wanted her to become what he was. He was very specific with himself about that from the beginning, and she understood it even at 10, in the way that children of serious people understand the texture of what is being asked of them. He put the rifle in her hands because he believed that a person who understood how a weapon worked truly understood it from the physics of the projectile through the mathematics of the environment to the psychology of the decision, was a person who understood something foundational about force and consequence and the weight of a choice. He taught her for years. Every weekend they could manage some mornings in summer when there was no school and the light came early and they could be at the range before the heat arrived. Distance, wind breath, trigger discipline. The mathematics of ballistics, the patience of waiting without losing focus. The difference between a shot that is possible and a shot that is right. When she was 16, she put a round on a target at 900 meters in a crosswind, and he looked at the result through his spotting scope for a long moment and said, "Adjust your follow-through." She adjusted it. He said nothing more. She understood that to be the highest compliment he knew how to give. She went to Johns Hopkins. He supported this with the same quiet directness he brought to everything. Her hands were for healing. He believed this without reservation, and the fact that he had also given them another capability was something he held carefully, the way you hold something precious and also complicated. In March of 2018, he sat down and wrote a letter. He did not tell her he had written it. He put it in an envelope and placed it where she would find it when the time came. He knew about his heart by then. The doctors had given him numbers, and he had understood what the numbers meant, and he was not afraid of what they implied, but he was practical about it. And practical action meant saying the things he wanted to say before saying them became impossible. He died on March 14th, 2019, in a hospital room in San Diego. He was 57 years old. She was 21. She was in her second year at Johns Hopkins. The call came at 6 in the morning, and she sat in her dormitory room for 1 hour and felt the specific rearrangement of the interior world that happens when the person who built the interior world is gone. The walls moved, the floor moved. Everything she had organized her understanding of herself around had to be reorganized. Then she stood up. She went to class. She did the next thing and the thing after that because that was what he had taught her. She found the letter with his things 2 weeks later when she went home for the days after the funeral. She opened it sitting in her childhood bedroom in Denton, Texas with the winter light coming through the window, and she read it once straight through without stopping and then she folded it and put it in her inside pocket, and she had carried it there every day since. She was thinking about all of this when she came back inside the wire and walked to the medical tent and spent an hour setting up her secondary trauma caches. She moved her primary equipment to 3 positions that she had identified as protected and accessible from multiple directions. She did this after dark alone, without telling anyone. Nobody saw her do it. She did it anyway. The next morning, 4 hours before the mission was scheduled to begin, she found Reed Kowalski. He was 23 years old and carried the energy that young operators carry before the first time something genuinely tries to kill them. The coiled readiness of a body that has been trained to its capacity and not yet presented with the invoice for that training. He was working through equipment checks on the south side of the main structure, moving well, looking well, presenting as exactly what his morning medical check had reported him to be, mission ready. She watched him for 90 seconds. She watched the specific way he blinked. The deliberateness of it, the fraction of additional effort that blinking was requiring, which was not a thing most people would notice, and which she noticed because noticing was what she had been doing in one form or another since she could remember. She watched his hands on the equipment. The grip was right, but the assurance was slightly off, a quarter-second delay in the transitions between items that should not have been there. She watched the way he tilted his head when another operator spoke to him from his left side slightly too late. A small lag in the orienting reflex. She walked over. Kowalski. He looked up with the easy attention of someone who has nothing to hide. Doc. Hold still a moment. He held still. She put 2 fingers to his wrist and counted. She looked at his pupils in the varying light. She asked him 3 questions in a specific sequence and listened not only to the answers, but to the timing of them. You're in the early stage of exertional heat illness, she said. Started probably yesterday afternoon based on the presentation. Core temperature is elevated. Heart rate is slightly irregular. You need fluids and rest, and you need to be moved off the heavy equipment rotation for the next 3 hours. He began the objection that she had already prepared for. Doc, I feel fine. Your reaction time is running about 12% slow, she said without elevation in her voice. You haven't noticed it because 12% is inside the range that feels normal when you're the one experiencing it. Tonight it will matter. If this progresses to the next stage in the field, you become a liability to your element and a danger to yourself and to the people around you. A pause. Commander Harwick is going to want to know about this. Kowalski looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. Then, okay, sit down. She had the IV kit open in 20 seconds. Harwick came over during the process and watched without speaking. When she finished and stood up, she gave the assessment concisely, full capacity in 3 hours with proper fluid replacement, limited duty until 1400. Harwick nodded once. He walked away. Briggs had been watching from 10 feet away. He said nothing. But he shifted his position to one slightly closer to where she was working, and he spent the next 30 minutes paying a different kind of attention than he had been paying before. The mission briefing ran at 1300 hours in the largest of the prefabricated structures. It was standing room. Harwick ran it with the economy of a man who understood that preparation and execution were the same process at different points in time, and every word he said had a function and performed it. Tessa stood at the back of the room. She had a notebook and a mechanical pencil, and she listened with the completeness of attention that makes a person effectively invisible in a crowd, because people who are watching everything are usually seen by no one. The topographic overlay was projected on the wall. Eastern Valley 8 kilometers from current position. Known weapons cache at a structure that satellite imagery confirmed was occupied. Ingress primary through the valley floor, secondary along the northern ridge. 1 dedicated sniper asset, Staff Sergeant Albrecht, with a proven long-range record. 1 medical element. She studied the overlay. 40 minutes in the discussion moved to viable overwatch positions on the secondary ridge route. Harwick indicated 2 positions on the map. She looked at both of them and looked at the terrain and looked at the valley floor below them, and without looking up from her notebook, she said, the outcropping at grid reference 477 creates a firing solution that puts your own element inside the risk corridor if there is any lateral spread. The rock shelf at 479, 30 meters further north eliminates that problem and gives a cleaner line to the target structure. The room was quiet. Harwick looked at the overlay. He looked at both positions. He looked at her. Where did you get that? He asked. I read the contours, she said. He studied the map for 5 more seconds. Then he redirected the briefing to the alternative position. Briggs was standing 6 feet to her left. She did not look at him. but she was aware of the adjustment in the quality of his attention, the subtle physical shift of a man who has been holding a conclusion and has just encountered a fact that the conclusion cannot fully accommodate. She wrote something in her notebook and said nothing else. The hours before a mission have a specific texture. The base changed through the afternoon movement, becoming more deliberate and more economical, the velocity of conversation dropping as men moved inward to the preparation that serious people do before serious things. Weapons were cleaned with the focus of men who had learned that this task could not be left to the hour before contact. Equipment was checked against lists and then checked again. She worked through her medical preparations. Then she sat with the letter. She did not take it out. She pressed her palm flat against her chest and felt it there, the familiar slight stiffness of the folded paper through the fabric of her jacket. It had been with her for 5 years, against her ribs, where the heartbeat was, where the things you carry closest live. Her father had understood something about time that most people understand in theory, but rarely apply in practice. He had understood that the moments which require the most important things to be said do not wait for convenient pauses in the schedule. They arrive unannounced and at high speed and without adequate warning, and the things that need saying need to have been said already in advance when there was still time to say them carefully. He had said his things in advance. She had read them enough times that they lived inside her now, part of the architecture of how she thought about herself, no longer. Instructions from outside, but something integrated. Something that had become less like a letter and more like bone. She pressed her palm against her chest. Outside the tent, the temperature dropped with the sun. They inserted at 2100 hours. 3 helicopters, lights off, running low through the mountain corridors. Tessa sat in the second aircraft with the medical element and watched the dark mountains move past the open door and thought about nothing in particular, which was something her father had taught her and which required years to develop correctly. The valley floor was 3 kilometers of open ground and then a rise of terrain that funneled toward the target location. The intelligence package rated the area low threat. Recent drone coverage had shown nothing unusual. The cache was supposed to be lightly defended. She had been in enough operational context to understand the gap between supposed to be and is. She did not distrust the assessment. She simply knew that assessments were made from data, and that data was always incomplete, and the incompleteness was reliably where the trouble lived. She kept this to herself. It was not her job to revise the mission parameters. It was her job to be fully ready for what the mission parameters might not have accounted for. They landed 2 kilometers from the objective. The helos dropped and were gone before the dust settled. The formation moved to approach, and the valley received them in the way that valleys in those mountains always receive movement after dark in complete, unreadable silence. She moved with the medical element, center formation standard position. She moved with the economy of someone conserving for what comes later. Vance Dunbar was 3 positions forward and to her left. Once in the first kilometer, he turned and found her in the dark with the accuracy of someone whose spatial awareness had been wired into his nervous system over decades, and he looked at her for 1 second and looked forward again. She scanned the ridgelines as she walked. She did this the way you do the things that have been trained into you early enough without conscious decision, as naturally as breathing and extracting information from the terrain, the way a reader extracts meaning from a page. At kilometer 3.5, she noticed something, a variance in the optical texture of a boulder cluster on the eastern ridge at roughly 2 o'clock from her position. Minor, easily explained, easily dismissed. She noted it and continued. 100 meters further, a different position, same quality of variance. Irregularity to the irregularity, a pattern in the randomness, the kind of thing that does not announce itself but accumulates. She registered it the way she registered everything her training had given her eyes to see, without alarm, without announcement, filed as information awaiting context. At 3 kilometers from the objective, the night broke open. The first RPG came from the eastern ridge, and the concussion rolled down the valley like a physical thing, a wave of pressure that you felt in your chest before you heard it as sound. Before the sound finished traveling, both ridges were alive with fire. It was coordinated, simultaneous, the kind of initiation that required planning and positioning and communication at a level far above opportunistic ambush. Somebody had known they were coming. Somebody had known the route, the timing, the formation. None of that mattered in the first 90 seconds. What mattered in the first 90 seconds was surviving them. The formation dispersed into cover with the practiced response of men who have trained for this moment until the training becomes faster than thought. Tessa hit the ground and was moving before the second RPG landed, moving left toward a rock outcropping she had noted during the approach 12 meters from her position, offering elevation and partial cover from the eastern ridge. She reached it in 6 seconds. She was already opening her trauma kit. The first casualty found her 11 seconds later. Shrapnel wound upper right arm, packed and wrapped in 2 minutes. The second casualty was Kowalski. He was losing ground fast. She assessed in 4 seconds femoral artery partial laceration, blood pressure in the right leg already compromised. The cat tourniquet went on high and tight without ceremony. Combat gauze packed directly into the wound with the pressure that feels wrong to the untrained and is absolutely correct. She talked to him while she worked, not the soothing noise of bedside manner, but specific clinical information delivered in a steady voice because she had learned that clarity worked better than comfort when men were operating on the edge of fear. Tourniquet is on. Pressure is building. You are going to feel it. That is correct. Look at my face, not at the wound. He looked at her face. Good, keep looking at my face. The third casualty came in from her left, and she moved before the operator helping him had finished reaching her. Tension pneumothorax signs, unmistakable tracheal deviation, absent breath sounds on the left respiratory distress climbing toward crisis. 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space midclavicular line inserted with the committed pressure the procedure required. The rush of air was the sound of a correct diagnosis confirmed. She moved. The fire from the eastern ridge was coordinated and effective. 2 heavy machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire that covered the natural escape routes, and pinned 3 elements of operators behind terrain with nowhere to go. The positions were protected by natural rock overhang from direct fire below. From the valley floor, there was no good answer to them. She was checking a 4th casualty when she heard Harak on the radio, "Does anyone have eyes on the eastern emplacements? I need options." She was aware of Albrecht. His shoulder wound had been stabilized in the first minutes of contact by another operator, but the right shoulder was gone, and the rifle that was Albrecht's whole function in this formation was sitting in his kit 20 meters away, and it was doing nothing. She was aware of the machine gun positions. She had been aware of them since the fire started tracking them the way she tracked everything, with the part of her attention that ran parallel to the medical work and never fully stopped. She finished with the 4th casualty. She looked at the eastern ridge. She looked at Dunbar, who was behind a rock 17 meters to her left, and Dunbar was looking at her with the expression of a man who has done the same calculation she is doing and is prepared to let her decide. She put her trauma kit down. She picked it up again. She put it down. Above her, the machine gun position on the eastern ridge opened up on the drainage channel, where 40 operators were pinned with no cover to their right, and the sound of it was not abstract, not tactical. It was immediate and physical, and it contained the specific arithmetic of how much longer those 40 men could survive. She took the letter from her inside pocket. She held it against her palm for 3 full seconds. She felt the weight of the paper, the familiar slight stiffness of it, the 5 years of carrying it against her heart. She understood what he had said. She had understood it for years. She understood it now with the kind of finality that ends deliberation. She put the letter back. She looked at Dunbar. "Where is the M24? He had been waiting for precisely this question. Albrecht's kit, left side pocket. She moved. The M24 was exactly where Dunbar had said it would be. She pulled it clear, and the weight of it settled into her hands, and 16 years compressed into a single moment. Not a memory, not a retrieval of stored information. Something that lived below memory, below conscious recall, in the place where things that have been practiced 10,000 times live permanently. The way your hands know the handle of your own front door in total darkness, before the light, before the thought. She checked the chamber. Round seated, magazine secure, safety engaged. She ran her right thumb along the stock and found the scope and confirmed it was the Schmidt and Bender 312 that Albrecht used. Not her preferred configuration, but within the range of adaptable, and she was already mapping the adjustments she would need before she had consciously decided to make them. Dunbar moved to her left without being directed. He understood positioning the way people understand their native language, not as a set of acquired rules, but as a physical grammar, absorbed so early it feels like instinct. He placed himself 12 meters to her left and slightly forward, which gave him sight lines to the north slope and put him in position to read wind. She was moving before the decision had finished forming. The north slope rose at approximately 35 degrees, where she needed to climb. Fractured shale and limestone loose in places, stable in others, and the darkness that made everything harder was also the darkness that made movement possible. She moved low and without sound, which is not a natural human behavior, but a learned one, the product of years of practice in moving across surfaces without announcing the movement, distributing weight in the specific way that does not transfer vibration into sound. The fire from the eastern ridge was continuous and to her right, and she moved through it the way you move through rain, present to it, not stopping for it. 3 rounds struck rock within 15 meters. She adjusted her route by 4 meters and kept climbing. Dunbar's voice in her earpiece, a breath above silence. Wind east-northeast. 12 miles per hour consistent. Temperature 41 degrees. Altitude differential to the target position approximately 60 meters. Filed, noted, applied. She climbed. The machine gun position on the eastern ridge was at 780 meters horizontal distance and 60 meters above the valley floor. She was reaching the altitude of the position with an angular line that the operators below could not reach because the overhang that protected the position from direct fire beneath it provided no protection from this angle. She had understood this geometry for 2 hours. Since the briefing, when her eyes had moved to the ridgelines and her mind had done what her mind does. She found a rock shelf that jutted from the slope at the height she needed. She went flat. The cold of the rock came through her jacket and pants, and she registered it as information and set it aside. She extended the bipod. She settled the rifle into her shoulder, and it found the correct position without negotiation, without the small adjustments of someone working with an unfamiliar platform. She looked through the scope and acquired the terrain. The machine gun emplacement was there. 2 men, one on the gun, one managing the ammunition feed and watching their left flank. They knew their work. The natural rock overhang above them was augmented with sandbags. They had a commanding view of the valley floor covering the natural routes that operators below were trying to use. 780 meters. She breathed. Her father had taught her when she was 10 years old, and standing in a field in Texas in the early morning, that shooting at distance was not an act of force. It was an act of mathematics and biology and the specific discipline of making your body an instrument of precision for the duration of a moment so brief that most people could not find it. He had said it took 5 years to learn to do it adequately and 20 years to learn to do it well, and the difference between adequately and well was the difference between chance and intention. He had started teaching her at 10. She mapped the wind. East-northeast 12 miles per hour, consistent, confirmed from 2 positions. At 780 meters, a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind produced a lateral drift of approximately 14 inches at the bullet weight she was working with. She adjusted the windage turret. She addressed elevation for the altitude differential and the temperature drop and the slight Coriolis effect that was minor at this range and not ignorable. She set her breathing. 4 seconds in. Hold. 8 seconds out. The rhythm that brought the heart rate down from operational tempo toward the low 60s, which was where precision lived. She had been doing this since she was 12 years old, and it was as automatic now as any of the other things her body had learned to do without asking permission. She found her natural point of aim, adjusted 2 inches right to keep the position stable because a shooting position that requires active muscular effort to maintain introduces error at the moment of firing. She placed the reticle on the first target. She waited for her heartbeat, found it in her chest, her wrist, her throat, found the pause between contractions, the quarter second of stillness, when the body is between beats and the tremor that the heart produces is at its minimum. That was the window. She squeezed. The rifle moved back into her shoulder with the controlled recoil of a platform she had shot 1,000 times, and she held through it and brought the scope back down to the target. The shot had gone right, 8 inches right. The target was still moving, reacting to the sound, beginning to shift position behind the sandbags. From below, she heard Briggs's voice, the specific tone of a man whose assessment has been confirmed. She did not hear the words. She heard the tone. It did not matter. What mattered was the correction. She recalculated. The wind had a gust component. She had not fully weighted a variance within the base wind that was irregular rather than constant. She watched the thermals in the scope, the way the heat from the rock face bent the air in a pattern that had a cycle. She timed it across 3 repetitions, confirmed approximately 8 seconds between gusts. She moved the windage 4 clicks left, found her breathing again, found the heart rate, found the pause between beats. She waited for the gust to pass through its cycle to its minimum, the 2-second window of relative stillness at the base of the variance. She placed the reticle. She squeezed. The machine gun position went silent. Dunbar's voice in her earpiece, quiet and without inflection. Target down, gun is clear. She was already repositioning. The second emplacement was 140 meters south along the eastern ridge, different angle, different elevation. She moved 30 meters along the slope to find the sight line she needed smooth and low, because hurrying on a slope in the dark with the rifle is how you lose the platform and the shot and possibly everything else. She settled, acquired 920 meters across two ridgelines of thermals and through a wind shear at the midpoint that she identified by watching the dry grass on the valley floor below for 40 seconds. One round. The position went down on the first shot. She moved again. It took 37 minutes, 6 separate firing positions. The emplacements came down one by one, the heaviest first, then the support positions, then 2 light machine gun nests on the western ridge that had been less effective but were still blocking the retreat corridors. She moved between positions in the dark and with the economy of someone executing a plan she had drawn in her head before the first shot was fired, and she fired when the conditions were correct and only then, and every shot after the first was a first-round engagement. Below her in the valley, the picture changed as she worked. The trapped elements began to move as the fire covering their positions was removed. She heard Harwick redirecting elements through the corridors she was opening, and she listened with one part of her attention while the other part worked the problem, because she had been doing two things at once for long enough that the division felt natural. She did not think about what she was doing in the sense of deliberate reflection. She was past deliberation. Deliberation had happened at the base of the slope in the 2 seconds before she reached for the rifle, and it had produced a decision, and the decision had been made, and what remained was execution. And execution did not require deliberation. It required the three things her father had spent 6 years installing in her: focus, patience, and the commitment to follow through past the difficult part, which is always the middle and which is always where people stop. She did not stop in the middle. When the last position went down, she held her position for 90 seconds and swept the ridgeline systematically, and when she was satisfied, she keyed her radio. Commander Harwick, eastern and western ridge emplacements are neutralized. Valley corridors are open. Recommend extraction via primary road. A pause. Then Harwick's voice, carrying the specific quality of a commanding officer processing information that does not fit the model he has been using. Copy that, Doc. What is your position? North slope, approximately 80 meters above the valley floor. I'm coming down. A longer pause this time. Come down slowly, he said. She descended with the rifle and came off the rock onto the valley floor. And Dunbar was there, and Harwick was 3 meters behind Dunbar, and behind Harwick was a loose gathering of operators who had emerged from the terrain as the fire ended, and who were in one way or another looking at her. She did not look back at them. She carried the rifle to Albrecht's kit and secured it and opened her trauma kit and turned to the nearest casualty. Who else needs attention? There is a particular quality to silence that follows a moment that a room full of experienced people does not know how to process. It is not the silence of confusion. The men in that valley understood the sequence of events perfectly well in the technical sense of understanding. The data had been recorded. The shots had been fired and the positions had gone down, and she had come off the slope with the rifle and secured it and gone back to the medical work without pause or performance or any apparent expectation that the preceding 37 minutes required acknowledgement. The silence was the silence of recalibration, of a working model encountering a fact that it cannot accommodate without revision. Briggs stood at the edge of this silence for 4 minutes. Then he walked to where she was working on a staff sergeant named Dowd, a ricochet in the calf that was manageable and needed proper attention, and he stood there and watched her work and said nothing for 2 minutes. His expression was the expression of a man doing an honest accounting. Then he said, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She did not look up from the wound. "My father taught me." "Who was your father?" She glanced at him briefly. Back to the wound. "A Navy man." Briggs looked at Dunbar, who was standing 6 feet away, with the equanimity of a man who has been holding information patiently and is prepared to continue holding it for as long as necessary. Harwick came to stand beside Briggs. He had the look of a commanding officer doing what commanding officers train themselves to do after unexpected events, which is to absorb the new information without allowing it to destabilize the function of command. He was doing this competently, but his eyes were on her with the focused attention of a man building a new model. "Cole," he said. "Sir." "When you are finished." 3 minutes, sir." He waited. She finished with Dowd and stood and turned to face Harwick, and he met her eyes differently than he had met them the day before. "Your father," he said, "Frank Cole, retired Master Chief, SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Harwick looked at Dunbar. Frank Cole, Dunbar said. He said it in the way you say the name of something you have known for a long time to confirm its presence. Briggs had moved away from them. He had gone to find a satellite uplink, and he was going to pull Frank Cole's personnel record, and what he found there was going to require the rest of the night to properly absorb. The valley was quiet now in the way that valleys are quiet after violence has moved through them, which is not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of aftermath carrying the imprint of everything that just happened in the texture of the air itself. She looked at Harwick. I have 4 more casualties who need assessment before we move. Do it, he said. He watched her go. An hour before dawn, when the casualties were stable and the perimeter was holding and the operators not on watch had found positions to rest in the specific way that soldiers rest in the field, Harwick found her. She was at the eastern edge of the position, back against a rock, restocking the trauma kit, with the practiced hands of someone who has organized and reorganized this kit so many times that the contents have spatial addresses in her muscle memory. He sat down at a distance that said, I want to talk, not interrogate. She was listening before he opened his mouth. Somalia, he said. Her hands paused for a single beat. October 3rd and 4th, 1993. He talked about it twice in my life, once when I was 14 and asked him directly, once when I was 20 during a conversation about trauma physiology, and he told me something about sustained combat over duration that he had learned there and that I needed to understand from my medical work. She resumed the inventory. Most people who were there don't talk about it. No, Harwick said, they don't. He looked at the dark horizon. He trained you himself. From 10 years old, 6 years formally. Every weekend we could manage in mornings in summer. Distance wind trigger discipline, the mathematics of it, the patience of it. She secured a case latch. He never stopped teaching me. He stopped being able to teach me anything new around 19. After that, it was maintenance, not instruction. And then he passed. And I made a promise to my mother. She said it without sentiment as a factual account of a sequence. She had watched him leave for 30 years. She asked me to leave the weapons side of his work behind him when he was gone. Not everything, just the part that had nothing to do with healing. I promised her. And tonight was about what the work required. She looked at him for the first time since he had sat down. My father taught me the difference between a promise and the thing a promise is protecting. A promise is a structure. What it is protecting is the reason the structure was built. When the structure and the reason come apart from each other, you have to decide which one you are actually keeping faith with. Harwick looked at her. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was the best man I have ever known, she said, not with softness, with the plainness of a statement that has been tested by time and has survived. He was quiet for a moment. Chief Dunbar says Frank Cole was a ghost. He said it was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Vance Dunbar chooses his words carefully. He said the same thing about you. She did not respond to that. Harwick stood. He was quiet for a moment before the last thing. I'm going to need a full debrief when we extract, he said. Not about tonight in the tactical sense. About you, about how you came to be on this deployment and what capabilities you have and what I should have known that I did not know. Not as discipline, as command responsibility. I need to understand what assets I have. Understood, sir. He began to move. Commander, he stopped. Kowalski needs extraction to a surgical facility within 6 hours. The field stabilization is solid, but it has a clock on it. I've already called it in. He looked at her one more time. Get some rest, Cole. She looked back at her kit and began a second inventory pass. She did not tell him that rest was not available in the way he meant it. She simply returned to the work because the work was what was available and the work was enough. There is a letter. She first read it at 21 years old in a dormitory room in Baltimore, with the winter light coming through the window and the ordinary sounds of a university morning going on outside, sounds that had nothing to do with the thing she was holding in her hands. She had found it with his belongings 2 weeks after the funeral, the only envelope in his files addressed to her, and she had sat down in her childhood bedroom with the weight of fresh grief, and she had opened it. He had begun with the practical matters because he was a practical man. Financial documents, his attorney's name, the pension procedures, the veterans' benefits. He was thorough and organized, and she had been grateful for it in the weeks that followed, because having a clear set of next steps when everything else has dissolved is one of the most useful gifts one person can give another. Then he had written this. He had written Tessa. I want to tell you something that I would tell you in person if I knew when the time would come. But time does not wait for convenient moments, and I have learned that the things which need saying need to be said in advance before the moment arrives, because in the moment there is not always room to say them correctly. He had written, "You made a promise to your mother, and I respect that promise. I was the reason she needed to ask for it, and I understand what she was asking and why. Your mother is wiser than either of us in the specific way that people are wise when they have loved someone who does dangerous work for 30 years and have learned to live with what that love requires." He had written, "But I also want to say this. I am the man who taught you what you know. I taught you because I believed it was the right thing to teach you, not to make you into what I am. I was very clear about that with myself from the beginning. I taught you because understanding something completely all the way to its roots is the only way to carry it correctly. A person who does not understand a thing is controlled by it. A person who understands it has a choice." He had written, "I believe in your judgment. I have believed in it since you were 12 years old. You have a quality I cannot name exactly, something in the way you weigh information and arrive at decisions. It is not common. In 40 years of working alongside people in difficult conditions, I can count on one hand the number of people I have seen it in." He had written, "There will come a moment when you have to choose between the promise and what you know is right. I cannot tell you when that moment is or what the choice should be. I can only tell you that I trust you to know the difference. And I can tell you that whatever you decide, I will have been proud of you long before the moment arrives." He had signed it, "Your father." Not "love your father," not always, just "your father," which was exactly correct, which was the only thing he would have signed it. She had read the letter 40 times since the day she found it. She knew every word without opening the envelope. But she kept it because the physical object carried something the memorized words did not: the specific texture of the paper, the pressure variations of his handwriting, the quiet fact of his hand having moved across this page and produced these sentences in a room she could picture. She had pressed it against her palm at the base of the slope before she reached for the rifle. Now she sat with the kit in the inventory and the cold and let the dawn do what dawns do, which is to make everything that happened in the dark gradually and unsentimentally specific. At first light, she allowed herself to think about the promise. She had broken it. There was no accounting for this that made it not so. She had stood in her mother's kitchen in Denton, Texas, and she had made a promise with the full intention of keeping it, and tonight she had not kept it, and both of those things were true and had to coexist in the same space. Her father had told her they would coexist. He had told her there would be a moment when the promise and the right thing would not be the same thing, and that she would know the difference when it came. She had known the difference. 60 operators were going to see this sunrise. Kowalski was 23 years old and would go home after a surgery and a period of rehabilitation and eventually live a full life. The 40 operators in the drainage channel who would have taken the mortar round if the positions had not been cleared would see another morning and the morning after that. She folded that thought and put it somewhere it could be carried. Then she sat and watched the valley come out of the dark. Briggs found her an hour after dawn. He came without ceremony and sat down on a rock beside her and looked at the mountains for a while before speaking. When he spoke, he did not look at her. "Frank Cole," he said, "I pulled his record on the satellite uplink this morning." She waited. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed long-range engagements during the Kuwait ground campaign, all within sanctioned engagement parameters. Somalia. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 7 commendations, 4 of them classified at levels I could not access. He paused. What is in the unclassified portion of that record would take most shooters a career to produce. I can only assume the classified portion is proportionally significant. She said nothing. "I said something when you landed," he said. "I know. I want to take it back. I know I can't." He looked at her then, not with the expression he had worn the day before, with the expression of a man doing an honest accounting. "I made a judgment from one data point and called the judgment complete. That is not protecting my element. That is something else, something I have been wrong about before and should know better than to repeat." "You were making a professional assessment from available information," she said. "You were doing what you were supposed to do." "I was doing it wrong," he said. "Wrong method, wrong conclusion." She let that sit for a moment. "Hold it briefly," she said. "Then put it somewhere it can be useful." "That is what my father would have said." He looked at her. Was he a man who said things like that directly? He was a man who said things like that exactly once and expected you to have heard it. She paused. He would have spent considerable time identifying exactly what had gone wrong tonight and what should have been different, and then he would have said the result was acceptable. That was the highest compliment he gave. Briggs sat with that for a moment. Then he stood. Something in his posture had changed, some structural adjustment that went below the surface of visible expression. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you did on that slope was exceptional. By any standard I know how to apply." He walked away. She watched him go. The extraction came at 900 hours. She spent the flight with her hands on two casualties, monitoring both, managing both, talking to both in the clear clinical voice that steadied men whose bodies had been damaged in ways they were still assessing. Kowalski was awake for most of the flight. He looked at her several times and said nothing, which was the right thing. The forward operating base appeared below them, and they were down. She moved directly from the landing pad to the medical tent and began the handoff process, full documentation of every field intervention, verbal transfer to the base medical staff, clear record of every decision made under fire. She did this with the thoroughness that a field-to-base handoff required, because a handoff done poorly was how patients who had survived contact did not survive the base. It took 2 hours. When she came out of the medical tent, Harwick was waiting. He was standing with his arms at his sides in the expression of a man who has completed his initial processing and has arrived at the questions that require a different kind of conversation. They sat on equipment cases outside the tent. "Tell me how you came to be on this deployment," he said. "The original corpsman, Lieutenant Marsh, developed acute appendicitis 4 days ago. The slot was offered to the contractor pool. I applied." "Why?" She had been waiting for this question. "Because I reviewed the operational parameters before applying. The mission profile showed a single dedicated sniper asset. I reviewed Staff Sergeant Albrecht's record. Excellent operator, strong history. But the Overwatch requirements for this terrain at this scale called for secondary capability at minimum. The slot was posted for a medical contractor." She met his eyes. "I had both, so I applied." Harwick looked at her for a long time. "You knew before you got on the helicopter that you might need capabilities you were not listed as having." "I knew it was possible. I did not know it would happen." "You didn't disclose the capability." "I disclosed everything on my official record. My tactical training is not on any official record. My father trained me privately for personal education, not for operational designation. It exists in no document that NavSpecWarcom has ever created or received." She kept her eyes level. "If I had disclosed it, the slot would have been processed differently. There are channels for additional sniper assets. Those channels take time. I had 4 days. And the channels would have resulted in someone being told a slot existed, not someone who had already evaluated the specific requirements of this mission profile and understood exactly what the slot needed to cover." He was quiet. "You came knowing what they needed," he said slowly, "and you put yourself in position to provide it without announcing that you were doing so." "Yes." "Why not announce it?" She considered this. "Because if I had arrived as a sniper asset with a medical secondary, the first conversation would have been about my credentials and my standing and my operational history, none of which exists in any file that could be verified. I would have spent this deployment justifying my presence instead of doing the work my presence was for." She paused. The work was more important than the justification. Harwick stood and walked 4 steps away and stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned. "I'm going to report tonight accurately," he said. "All of it. That report is going to move through the chain in ways I cannot predict. I want you to understand that." "I understand. It may complicate things for you." "Sir, 3 KIA, 22 wounded, mission objective not reached. The situation is already complicated. What I did in that valley either gets reported accurately or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, the only person it protects is me, and protecting me is not the priority." He looked at her for a long moment. "Write it accurately," she said. He nodded once. He walked away toward the command structure. She sat on the equipment case and looked at the mountains in the full morning light, clean and hard and very specific, the way everything looks after a night that has taken things from you and left you still standing on the far side of it. She put her hand against her chest. "She thought I broke a promise, and it was the right thing. She thought he knew this would happen. She thought I think I always knew it too." She stood up and went back inside to finish the documentation. The intelligence package on Owen Graff arrived at 1300 hours on the second day, delivered by satellite uplink, and Harwick read it twice before he called the senior element leaders together. It was not a long document. The important things rarely are. Graff had been born in 1973 in Knoxville, Tennessee. He had enlisted in the Army at 18 and moved through the selection process that identifies a particular kind of person and routes them toward a particular kind of work. He went through Delta Force assessment. He was recruited by the CIA's Special Activities Division in his early 30s, the branch that handled operations in the space between official and unofficial, the work that governments require and do not name. He was good at it. By every account, he was very good at it. His file described a man of unusual tactical intelligence and the specific kind of moral seriousness that distinguished operators who understood the weight of what they were doing from operators who had learned not to think about it. Graf had never learned not to think about it. His file noted this as an asset in the early years and a complicating factor in the later ones. In 2012, he led a 4-person team into Syria on a mission designated Cardinal. The team achieved its objective. On extraction, their position was compromised. They called for support. The helicopter was dispatched. Then 40 minutes before arrival, it was redirected. The official reason, atmospheric conditions. The atmospheric record from 2 independent monitoring stations in the region that night showed nothing unusual. 3 of the 4 men on Graf's team died in the hours that followed. Graf was taken. He spent 18 months in conditions that the human body was not designed to survive. Then he was out through a series of events that the document described with the specific vagueness of things that are known and cannot be fully written. He was declared KYA in December 2012. He was not dead. He had been alive and building something for 12 years, and what he had built was currently positioned in the mountains around this base with resources and operational planning that was not the work of grief or madness. It was the work of a man who had spent a decade thinking clearly about a specific problem, how to make certain people answer for certain decisions. Harwick put the document down. He is not an ideologue, Harwick said. He does not want to destroy anything in an abstract sense. He has a specific objective, which is to force into the light a set of decisions that were made in darkness and have never been accounted for. He paused. That does not make what he has done acceptable. It makes him more dangerous than someone with an abstract purpose, because a man with a specific rational objective plans differently than a man who is simply angry. The room absorbed this. He will try again tonight, Harwick said. No one asked how he knew. The logic was self-evident. A man who had built something for 12 years did not abandon it after one failed attempt. Tessa sat at the edge of the room and said nothing. She had read the document over Harwick's shoulder when he first opened it, which she had done without asking permission and which he had not objected to. She had read it once and it had settled into her with the particular weight of information that rearranges the way you understand the situation you are inside of. She thought about a man in a valley in Syria in 2012 calling for help that was coming and then was not coming, and the 4-person window between the call and the silence where everything changed. She thought about what a person carries out of 18 months of that, what it does to the structure of how a person relates to the world, to institutions, to the concept of being on a side. She thought about the specific texture of a betrayal that comes from people who were supposed to be your people, and the way that particular kind of betrayal works on a person over years. She did not say any of this. She went back to the medical tent. She spent 4 hours in preparation. She restocked the forward trauma kits, repositioned her secondary caches to locations that accounted for the likely attack vectors of a second assault from a man who had studied his first failure and would not repeat it. She reviewed every casualty from the previous night with the attention of a physician who knows that field stabilization is not the same as resolution, and that the clock on several of these conditions had not stopped. Then she ate a full meal methodically because her father had been relentless about nutrition and sleep as operational factors rather than luxuries, and he had been right about this as he had been right about most things. She slept for 90 minutes, the compressed and genuine rest of someone whose nervous system has learned to use every available window. She went back to the medical tent and checked her preparations again. Dunbar found her there at 1700. He came in without announcement and stood at the entrance, and they looked at each other with the ease of 2 people who have been through enough in a short time that context no longer requires establishment. Tonight is going to be harder, he said. I know. Last night you had terrain and darkness and the advantage of no one knowing what you could do. Tonight Graf knows. He looked at her steadily. He will plan for what he learned. She nodded. How are your hands? She looked at her hands, turned them over. A small blister on the pad of her right index finger from the previous night's work, a minor thing that she noted as data about her condition. Fine, she said. He was quiet in the way that Vance Dunbar was quiet when he had been holding something and had decided to say it. Your father sent me an email, he said. January 2019, 2 months before he died. She was still. He wrote to tell me about something you were doing, something he was proud of. He was not a man who wrote emails as a general practice, so I understood that he was writing because it mattered to him to put it somewhere. Dunbar looked at the tent wall as if reading something on it. He said you had begun working with a naval special warfare training program. Voluntarily, in an advisory capacity. Anonymous. He paused. He said you had developed a methodology for integrated tactical medicine that he believed was the most important contribution to special operations training he had seen in 20 years. His exact words. She looked at the supply case in front of her. He said you were doing it anonymously because you didn't want the designation to interfere with the instruction. He said that was the correct decision. He said it was typical of you. She closed the case. He knew, she said. He knew. She was quiet. The afternoon light came through the tent fabric and lay in rectangles across the equipment, and outside the wind moved through the base. Dunbar continued, I want you to know why I didn't say this sooner. When you arrived, I recognized what you were, but I didn't know the full picture. I knew Frank had a daughter doing something meaningful in the training pipeline. I didn't know the scale of it. I didn't know you were the voice. He met her eyes. And I thought if I said something too early, it would change how you move through this situation. Frank trusted you to work without external validation. I thought I owed him the same trust. She looked at him for a long moment. He was always 3 steps ahead, she said. Yes, he was. You've known since I walked off the helicopter. I suspected. I confirmed it when I heard how you described the Overwatch position in the briefing. The methodology has a specific architecture. I recognized it. He paused. He taught you everything he knew, and then you took it somewhere he hadn't. She did not respond to that immediately. She had spent 3 years building something in the margins in the hours between her contracted medical duties, in the space between what she was paid to do and what she understood needed to be done. She had developed a curriculum, not an institutional program with a title page and an approval chain. A methodology built from first principles, addressing a gap she had identified in how special operations teams understood the relationship between medical intervention and tactical decision-making. She had delivered it through an anonymous voice coaching protocol. No name, no designation, no record traceable to anyone. The operators who had worked through it called the anonymous voice the mentor. She had never acknowledged that name. She had never denied it. She had done the work. Tonight, she said. Tonight, Dunbar agreed. He left the tent and she stayed with the afternoon light for 1 more minute. Then she went to find Harwick. Graf came at 2200 hours. He came from below from the south using the drainage system that ran beneath the valley floor, a series of cut channels and natural rock corridors that the base survey had rated non-accessible. The survey had been correct about the accessible portions. It had not been correct about all of them. 200 men emerged from 4 points along the southern perimeter simultaneously. They moved with the coordination of people who had received specific training in base assault operations. This was not a second attempt at the same approach. This was a different plan executed by the same mind, and the different plan reflected a clear analysis of why the first had failed. The perimeter held for the first 4 minutes. Harwick had anticipated the southern vector and positioned accordingly. The fire that met Graf's first wave was disciplined and concentrated and broke the wave against it. Then the second wave came, then the third. The coordinated pressure from 3 simultaneous directions compressed the defensive space faster than the plan had accounted for, in the specific way that defensive planning can fail when the attacker has absorbed the previous engagement and made accurate corrections. Tessa was in the medical tent when the attack began, and she was at the eastern perimeter 45 seconds later, moving in the low crouch that kept her beneath the fire lines. Medical kit in her left hand, the M24 over her right shoulder. She moved without conscious reflection on the combination because she had stopped thinking of the combination as contradictory somewhere in the course of the previous 18 hours. The eastern perimeter was being held by a 12-man element with Briggs running it. She reached them and immediately identified the highest priority casualty, a petty officer named Holloway, with a through-and-through wound in the right thigh that had not yet been addressed. She went to work on Holloway while simultaneously assessing the position. The fire from the southeast was coming from a fixed elevation 200 meters out that gave Graf's men a commanding view of the entire eastern perimeter. Briggs had 2 shooters working to suppress it, but the angle was insufficient, and the suppression was keeping the position occupied rather than neutralizing it, which was a meaningful and urgent distinction. She finished Holloway's wound. Tourniquet packing pressure. Briggs, that elevation at 210, your angle is wrong. He glanced at her. He did not argue. 400 meters, moving targets. I see two firing positions. The left is exposed at the top of its cycle. She was already moving to a position that gave her a lateral line the other shooters could not find. Give me 60 seconds. She went flat behind a supply case, found the position in the scope calibrated for the dark and the distance, and the wind that was different at this elevation from what it had been on the open slope. The target had a cycle of exposure, 3 seconds visible, 4 seconds protected. She confirmed it across 3 cycles, and then on the 4th she fired. The left position went down. She moved north along the perimeter wall 40 meters to find the angle on the right position, which had adjusted when the left went silent. Went flat, acquired, fired. The elevation went quiet. She was back at Holloway in 30 seconds, checking his pressure, adjusting the tourniquet tension before Briggs had finished processing what had just happened. He looked at her. There was nothing adequate to say. He said nothing. She was already moving to the next casualty. At 22:40, Kowalski went down. He had been cleared for limited duty and placed at a secondary perimeter position, which had become a primary position as the perimeter compressed. He had been doing the work, holding the line, and then he was on the ground with the abrupt totality of a man whose body has reached a threshold. She had been monitoring his respiratory pattern across the afternoon with the background attention she applied to all post-intervention patients. His oxygen saturation at 1600 had been borderline. His breathing had shown slight splinting that she had attributed to pain management. She had been wrong to attribute it that way, and she had been building a reassessment in the back of her clinical mind across the evening, and when she heard the quality of his breathing change at 22:40, she recognized it immediately for what it was. She reached him in 6 seconds. The tension pneumothorax that had been developing, fed by the altitude changes during the extraction runs and accelerated by the physical demands of the current engagement, had reached its threshold. Tracheal deviation. Absent breath sounds on the left. Respiratory distress at crisis level. Kowalski, look at my face. He could not speak. His face had the specific color of someone whose oxygen is dropping faster than consciousness is registering. She pulled the 14-gauge needle, found the landmark by feel in the dark. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Inserted it with the committed pressure that the procedure required, not tentative, because a hesitant needle decompression was a failed one. The rush of air, the visible change in his face, his chest beginning to move correctly. She kept her hand on his sternum and counted his respirations and watched his color return and talked to him in the clear clinical voice. Needle is in. Your lung is reinflating. Breathe slowly, slower than you want to. That's correct. He breathed. She kept her hand on his chest and felt his body correct itself, and she was simultaneously tracking the sound of the firefight, with the other half of her attention running both processes in parallel, the way she had been running parallel processes since the day she understood that she would always be both things at once. She heard the change. The character of the incoming fire from the western position shifted. Something had moved. Something had repositioned and found a line that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. She looked up from Kowalski. Harwick was at the western position, 70 meters away, exposed at the edge of a supply structure. He had moved there to redirect an element, which was the correct command decision, and he was exposed because command decisions require presence and presence requires exposure, and the approach to that position had been clear when he made the decision. It was not clear anymore. A figure at the far perimeter edge, 240 meters out, had a direct line to where Harwick was standing and was in the process of taking it. She calculated the time available. It was approximately 3 seconds. She released Kowalski and said to the operator beside him, "Both hands on his chest, do not let him sit up." She was already moving not toward Harwick, but to the supply case 8 meters to her right that gave her the angle. She did not go flat. No time for flat. She went to one knee behind the case rifle up, scope acquiring in the dark. No time for the breathing protocol. No time for the heart rate descent. She found the figure in the reticle and she squeezed. 240 meters in the time it takes a heart to complete one beat. Harwick turned at the sound. He looked at the position. He looked back at her. She was already back on her feet, crossing to Kowalski, her hand back on his chest, checking the decompression, confirming the lung was holding, running the assessment that she had been running before the interruption. Her father had talked about this once, not often. Once on a November morning at the range when she was 20, and had asked him directly how he thought about it, the combination of what he did and who he was when he was not doing it. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There is no combination. There is no separation either. There are just hands. Your hands know what they know." What you do with them is the product of everything you are. The skill is not in one hand or the other. It is in understanding when each is needed and in being willing to use both. Both hands. She held Kowalski's pulse with one hand and scanned the perimeter with the other and understood in the way that some things are understood at a level below articulation that she had become what he was pointing toward. Not what he was. He had been very clear about that. Never what he was pointing toward. Owen Graff called the withdrawal at 23:14. Nobody outside the perimeter knew the exact reason in the moment. The after-action analysis would later spend considerable time on the tactical factors, the loss of the southeast elevation, the failure of successive waves to break the perimeter, the disciplined response of the defensive positions. These were contributing factors. They were real, and they mattered. But the men who had been inside the perimeter watching it from the inside said something else when they talked about it. They said the withdrawal happened when something changed in the character of the pressure, when the force pressing against the base began to hesitate in a way that cascading hesitation moves through a unit when the unit senses something it cannot name. What they sensed was this: the base was not behaving like a base operating at its limit. Every position that was pushed found a response that was calibrated rather than desperate. Every advance that should have opened a gap found the went closing before it fully formed. There was an intelligence to the defense that Graff had not planned for, and at some level of operational instinct, his men could feel it. The base had something that his planning had not accounted for. They withdrew into the dark of the mountains. Harwick had extraction helicopters in the air within 4 minutes of the withdrawal. The base loaded out in 17 minutes. She was on the third helicopter with her hands on two casualties, simultaneously monitoring, both managing, both talking to both, in the clear voice that reached people through fear. The mountains fell away below and the darkness opened into the wider dark, and she watched the vital signs and did not think about anything beyond the work. It was enough to think about. Graff was captured on the third day. Harwick was present when they brought him in. He had requested to be there, and the request had been granted without explanation required. He stood across a table from a man who was 51 years old and moved with the economy of someone who had spent 12 years staying alive in difficult conditions. Graff's hands were steady. His face was unreadable. He looked at Harwick with the expression of a man who has been waiting for some kind of accounting and is not afraid of it. Harwick did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Syria, 2012. Graff said, "Yes." "What happened to your team?" "You know what happened. I want to hear it from you." Graff looked at him for a moment. Then he talked. He talked for 40 minutes in the flat declarative language of an operator narrating a debrief, and when he finished, the room was very quiet, and Harwick sat with everything that had been said. When he stood up, he did not apologize on behalf of the institution. He was not authorized to, and it would not have been adequate if he had been. But before he left, he said one thing. "It should have been in the record 12 years ago. I'm going to make sure it gets there now." Graff looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not forgiveness, not absolution. The expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has just been told that someone else now knows the weight exists and intends to do something about it. "That's enough," Graff said. Harwick's after-action report ran to 47 pages. He told her this in passing, not as an announcement, as a fact that existed alongside other facts. He had reported her capabilities accurately, all of them. He had reported the 22 positions across 2 nights and the field medical interventions and the decision-making that connected them, and he had framed his assessment in the most direct language he could find. He had also reported the question of disclosure and included his own analysis, which was that her decision had produced an outcome that a transparent application process would not have produced. He told her about the recommendation 4 days later, sitting across from her in the debrief room with the afternoon light coming through the narrow window. "There is a rear admiral who wants to talk to you," Harwick said. "Name is Caldwell, Thomas Caldwell. He has been the driving force behind an integrated training program in NavSpec-Warcom for the past 4 years. He authorized an anonymous coaching protocol 3 years ago as an experimental methodology." Harwick's expression held something that might have been humor in a different context. He authorized it without knowing who he was authorizing. She kept her expression level. "He wants a conversation, not an assignment, not an order. He wants to talk about the curriculum and what it could become with institutional support." Harwick looked at her. He says, knowing now who developed it, he would have authorized it more quickly. She thought about this. She thought about what scale meant in practical terms, about 4,000 individual learning experiences, and what those numbers became when the methodology moved through an institution rather than an anonymous protocol. She thought about whether the purity of the anonymous approach was worth more than the reach of the institutional one. "I'll talk to him," she said. Harik nodded. He looked at her one more time before he said the last thing. "My son is 22. He's in BUD/S right now. I think about the kind of training he's going to come out with, and I think about the gaps about the relationship between the medical and the tactical, and how we teach people to think about that relationship." He paused. "What you built is something he is going to need. What you built is something all of them need." He stood. He said, "I'm glad you came." It was Dunbar who told the full room. It happened the evening of the fifth day in the largest common space on the main base, which held several hundred of the 480, and the rest stood in the corridor outside where the words would reach them anyway, because that is how important words move through enclosed spaces. Tessa was not there. She was in the medical bay finishing the last of her documentation. Dunbar stood in the middle of the room and told them what he knew. He told them about Frank Cole, not the extended biography, not the full record, the essential thing, which was what kind of man Frank Cole had been, and what he had built across 30 years of service, and what he had understood about the work and about the person he was leaving behind him when he was gone. He told them about a daughter who had inherited something that could not be inherited through genetics alone, but which had been transferred through years of early mornings, and the specific kind of attention that a man gives to the thing he loves most. He told them about a promise and a night in a valley and a slope in the dark. And then he told them about the mentor. He told it simply in the direct declarative language that the men in that room used as their native tongue. He told them that the anonymous voice in the training protocol they had been working through for 3 years, the voice that had guided their small unit tactical medicine through scenarios that had turned out across the past 5 days to not have been hypothetical at all, was the same woman who had been on their base for 5 days as a listed medical contractor. The voice that had been in their earpieces on the radio during the second night's engagement, steady and specific and calibrated directing elements through a burning base with the calm of someone who had designed the emergency response before the emergency existed, had been her, lying behind a rock with a bullet wound in her shoulder. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when what has been said requires something more than cognitive processing. It requires the body to sit with it, to feel the shape of it before the mind can name it. Reed Kowalski was in the third row. He had heard the voice in the training protocol 42 times across 3 years. He had never met the person it belonged to and had never tried to find out because the methodology had told him the identity did not matter, and he had believed the methodology because it was correct. He sat in the third row and listened to Dunbar and thought about 42 sessions and the specific things that had changed in how he thought and moved and made decisions in the field. He thought about a valley floor and a tourniquet applied in 90 seconds and a needle in the dark and a hand on his chest telling him to breathe slowly. He stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood. The man to his left stood, the man behind him. It moved through the room the way the best things move through groups of people who have been through something real together. Not because anyone called for it, not because anyone organized it, but because the bodies understood before the minds finished processing. In the corridor, the ones who could not see into the room but had heard what Dunbar said were standing too. She was in the medical bay when Kowalski came in. He had been walking without assistance for 2 days, the wound stable, the tension, pneumothorax resolved, moving carefully but moving. He sat down across from her at the small table where she was completing her documentation, and he looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "I recognized your voice," he said. She did not confirm it immediately. "The third session," he said. "September 2 years ago, the mass casualty scenario with the IED and the secondary structural collapse. You said don't triage for efficiency, triage for outcome. The person who requires the most work is not necessarily the person you should work on first. Work toward the best aggregate outcome, not the best individual outcome." He paused. "I have thought about that distinction approximately 400 times since that session. It changed how I think about priority in every operational context I have been in." She put her pen down. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Why anonymous?" he asked. She considered this carefully. "Because if I had presented the methodology with a name and a background attached to it, the first conversation would have been about whether someone with my background had the standing to make claims about special operations training, whether a civilian contractor had the institutional authority to tell operators how to think." She looked at him. "That conversation is not about the instruction. It is about me, and the instruction is what matters. You didn't want the instruction to have to fight for credibility. I didn't want it to have to fight for anything. I wanted it to arrive clean and be evaluated on what it produced. He sat with that. 314 sessions across 3 years, he said. 14 operators per session average. That is more than 4,000 individual learning experiences built on your methodology. A pause. Including this base, including us, including what happened out there. She picked up her pen, looked at her documentation, then back at him. You should rest, she said. Your lung needs time. I know. He stood. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a young man who has encountered something that has permanently altered his understanding of something important. Doc, he said at the door. She looked up. He nodded once. Just once. She nodded back. The shoulder surgery lasted 2 hours and the repair was clean, and the prognosis was excellent for full recovery with appropriate rehabilitation. She woke from the anesthesia with the immediate alertness of someone whose nervous system had been waiting and came back to full function the moment the chemistry permitted it. Harwick was in the chair beside the bed. He looked up from his tablet when she moved. Surgery went well. I talked to the surgeon before they put me under. He put the tablet down. Caldwell called during the procedure. He has been the driving force behind the integrated training program for 4 years. He authorized the anonymous coaching protocol without knowing who he was authorizing. Harwick looked at her. He said knowing now who developed it, he would have authorized it more quickly and with better resources. What does he want? To develop the curriculum formally, with institutional support, proper funding, the capacity to scale across multiple training commands. He is not proposing you put on a uniform. He is proposing something that does not have a clean precedent, which is why he wants a conversation rather than a formal offer. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about scale, about what 4,000 became when the methodology moved through an institution rather than a protocol. She thought about Kowalski's careful arithmetic and what those numbers represented in terms of operators in the field carrying a different framework than the one they would have had otherwise. She thought about whether the value of the anonymous approach was greater than the value of the institutional reach, and whether that question even had a single answer, or whether the answer changed when the scale changed. I'll talk to him, she said. Harwick nodded. He was quiet for a moment before the last thing. My report is accurate, he said. All of it. What you did is in the record now. That does not go away. She looked at him. Good, she said. Briggs came the morning before she was cleared for travel. He came early in the window of a military morning, when the day is organizing itself, and he came in the way of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before the opportunity for revision arrives. He sat beside her bed. He looked at his hands for a moment. When you landed, he said, I said something. Colt, let me say this. She let him say it. I made a judgment in under 30 seconds from one data point, and I stated it publicly and I repeated it, and I was wrong in every measurable way that a person can be wrong about another person. He looked at her. I know you said I was protecting my element. I was. But I was also doing something else, which was treating a first impression as a completed assessment. That is not protecting my element. That is a bias I carry and have been wrong about before and should know better than to repeat. A pause. I'm sorry. She looked at him. Accepted, she said. He nodded once. Then, I want to be in the first cohort. She frowned slightly. Cohort. Whatever Caldwell is putting together, the curriculum, the formal program. I want to be a student in the first class. He met her eyes without apology. I am 41 years old with 12 years of operational experience, and I have spent all 12 of those years thinking about medical and tactical as two separate things. I was wrong about that for 12 years, and I want to be in the first class. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll put your name down, she said. He stood. He looked at her one more time. Your father, he said, whatever he was and whatever he built the right thing. Then he was gone. 6 months later. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. She had put back the 9 pounds she had lost across the deployment and the surgery and the weeks of recovery that followed, not quickly, not by effort, simply as the consequence of eating regularly and sleeping adequately and allowing the body to do what bodies do when they are no longer an emergency. Her left shoulder spoke to her in cold weather, and in the early morning before it warmed up, a low persistent ache in the repaired tissue that the surgeon had said might stay with her permanently. She had filed this in the category of things that were not problems. Data about the condition of the equipment. She ran at 5:30 every morning, 6 miles along the water, the Pacific on her left in the dark before sunrise, the salt air coming off the ocean, steady and cold and clean, the lights of Coronado reflected in the surface below. The same rote every morning. Her father had told her that routine was not rigidity. Routine was the structure that held everything else upright when the things around it were moving. After the run, she ate, and then she walked to the classroom building that had been allocated to the Integrated Combat Medicine program, which had completed its first cohort and was 2 weeks into its second. The first cohort had 16 students. The second had 22. The waiting list for the third cohort had 47 names. She stood at the entrance of the classroom and looked at the 22 people inside. They ranged in age from 22 to 44. They had collective operational experience that ran into the hundreds of years. They had come to this classroom because someone in the command structure had decided that the methodology deserved institutional support, and also because word had moved through the community the way it always moved through the channel of people who had been in hard places, talking to others who might be in hard places. And what they said was, there is a course. It teaches you something you do not know you need until you need it, and then you need it completely. You should take it. Reed Kowalski was in the back row. He had recovered fully cleared for return to full duty, and he had applied for the second cohort the day the application period opened. She had not given him special treatment. He had earned his seat the same way the other 21 had earned theirs. He was watching her when she entered. He nodded slightly. She nodded back. Colt Briggs was in the third row. He was sitting the way a serious student sits, fully upright, full attention, the posture of someone who has made a commitment to receive rather than to evaluate. The posture of a man who has revised a fundamental assumption about himself and is doing the work that follows revision. She walked to the front of the room. On the board behind her in her handwriting were 11 words. She had written them the night before the first cohort began, standing alone in the empty classroom, thinking about her father and the valley and the specific question of what you leave behind you that matters. She had not printed them, not typed them and formatted them and laminated them. She had written them by hand in permanent marker on the whiteboard, and she had not erased them between cohorts because they were not a lesson plan item. They were the architecture beneath everything else, the structure that the rest was built on. Heal when you can, fight when you must, know the difference. She looked at the room. 22 people, various ages, various backgrounds, various reasons for being here. What they shared was this: they had all been in places where the difference between those three things had mattered completely, and they had come here to understand it better. She called her mother on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting in her quarters with the window open and the sound of the Pacific coming through, the low, continuous sound of water against land that she had been falling asleep to for 6 months. Her mother was 63 years old and lived in the house in Denton, Texas, where Tessa had grown up and where Frank had kept a garden in the back acre with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything. Her mother had learned to tend the garden after he was gone, which she had said was the most surprising thing she had discovered about grief, that continuing someone's work was one of the ways you kept them present in the world. They talked for 40 minutes. Her mother asked about the shoulder, and she said it was fine, which was true. She asked about the students, and Tessa described the second cohort, the range of experience, the quality of attention, the specific satisfaction of watching an idea move through a room and produce understanding in people who would carry it into places she would never go. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was afraid when I understood what had happened over there. I was afraid, and I was angry, and then I was afraid again." "I know. And then I thought about what your father would say." "What would he say?" "He would say she knew what she was doing." A pause. "He would say she was exactly where she needed to be. He would say, I told her she would know the difference." "He did tell me," Tessa said. "I know he did, sweetheart. He told me he had." Her mother's voice had the quality of something that had been carried a long time and was being carefully set down, not discarded, just rested. "He was 3 steps ahead of everything, including this." "Yes." "Are you at peace with it?" Tessa looked at the open window. The sound of the ocean came through it, steady and dark. "I think I am," she said. "I think I have been for a while and just needed to say it out loud." "Good," her mother said. "That's enough." That night, she took the letter from the inside pocket of her jacket. She had carried it there for 5 years and 3 months, against her ribs. She sat at her desk and held it without opening it. She knew what was inside. She had read it enough times that the words had moved from paper to interior long ago, becoming less like external instruction and more like something structural, something that had become part of how she was built, rather than something she consulted. She held it for a moment. She thought about what he had said about the promise and the thing the promise was protecting, about moments when a person of integrity has to decide which one they are actually keeping faith with, about trusting your judgment when the moment arrives. She had trusted her judgment. It had been the right judgment. She opened the desk drawer, she placed the letter inside flat and centered, and she closed the drawer. Not away, not gone, just resting. She did not need to carry it against her heart anymore. What was in it had already become part of her, transferred from paper into the architecture of how she thought and chose and acted. She had been reading it for 5 years, and the reading had done its work, and now the work was inside her. She already was it. Monday morning, 8 o'clock. She stood at the front of the classroom with the Pacific light coming through the windows and the sound of Coronado in November outside. 22 people in front of her. The whiteboard behind her with 11 words in permanent marker words. She had written herself words she intended to mean exactly what they said. She had received a briefing the night before from Caldwell's office. Third cohort applications were arriving at twice the projected rate. 2 additional training commands were in active conversations about extending the methodology to their programs. The Senate Intelligence Committee's closed-door hearings on Syria had produced a preliminary record that would not be public for years, but which existed now, which meant that something that had happened in the dark had been moved into a document where the dark could no longer claim it fully. She thought about all of this briefly, and then she set it aside. She looked at Kowalski in the back row, who had his notebook open and his pen ready, and was paying the specific kind of attention that a person pays when they know from direct experience what the subject matter means in practice. She looked at Briggs in the third row, who was sitting straight and present and had already demonstrated in 2 weeks that a man who decides to learn something seriously can make significant progress in a short time if the decision is genuine. She thought about her father running 6 miles at 5:30 in the morning in San Diego. About a man who had understood that the most important work is often the work that produces no documentation, no commendation, no record that anyone can find by looking. He had understood that the work that endures is the understanding you create in other people, the thing that continues to move through the world after you are no longer in the room. Not the shots you take, the understanding you leave behind. She thought about a valley and a slope in the dark, and a letter pressed against her palm, and a decision made in the 2 seconds before reaching for something she had promised to leave in the past. She thought about 63 casualties and 477 men who had seen a sunrise they should not have seen, and about what that arithmetic meant, and about the specific person it had required her to be in the moment it was required. She thought about her mother's voice on the telephone, about a drawer in a desk and a letter at rest inside it after 5 years of being carried close, about what it meant to have arrived at the far side of something and be still standing. She looked at the room, 22 people who had been in hard places and were going to be in hard places again, who had come here to carry something different when they went back. She took a breath. "Let's get to work," she said, and they did.